Welcome once again to a closer look at the text, the teaching portion of Sisters in Scripture. Today we're going to look at Naomi from the book of Ruth. You know, the book of Ruth might just as or more aptly be called the book of Naomi, because even though Ruth is at the heart of the story, Naomi is, so to speak, the brains of the story. She is the protagonist. She is the one whose story it is as we move along through it. She's remarkable. And later part of her life, she's in a situation where she has lost everything. She has left her homeland. She's lost her husband, her two sons. She has no grandchildren. She is bidding adieu to her daughters-in-law and returning to what might be left of what she left behind. When you think about it, it is remarkable that somehow she managed to dig deep and had the resolve, the resources, the determination, the faith to move on in her life. She is not just a passive person, that she could envision a new possibility in the midst of this. So what we've got here is, I think, two women with complementary and impressive gifts. Naomi shows that she has a real grasp of what's going on throughout the story. She's the one with the understanding of Israel's laws and customs. She is focused. She never loses her intention of wanting the very best for Naomi and herself, Ruth and herself, to have a future. Ruth brings her generous, wonderful heart, her youth, her strength, her competence, and together they are a formidable combination. They are, I think, an example of relationships between women at their very, very best. So what we've got here is this wonderful, heartwarming story of two women who combine forces against terrible odds and overcome adversity through their determination, their love, their loyalty, and their faith. Yes. But do we have more? Well, this is the closer look at the text. So we are going to dig deeper, and we're going to see what else this story represents. To do that, we are going to focus on the fact of her being a Moabite woman. You know, Israel struggles throughout all of its story, if you read the Old Testament, with what to do about the foreigner in their midst, the foreigner, particularly foreign women. There are stories that teach the moral, this is going to go terribly bad because of the woman accepted into our midst, Jezebel and Cosby, for example. But then there are also stories like this one of Ruth and Rahab, where this foreign woman is the reason that everything goes wonderfully well. Israel is a little mixed here. We get both kinds of stories in the scripture, and the question is, does this make Israel stronger, or does it dilute who and what Israel is? What does this do to our covenant, basically? And I think it's still a relevant question today. These last few decades have seen a global migration probably unlike anything in human history. And so the question that Israel faced is our question as well. How do we adapt to this? What will our stance toward this be? The Moabite is more than, in this story, just a foreigner as well. Because it was the Moabite women who tempted the Israelite men back in the days of their wandering through the desert before they even got to the promised land. So As a result, in Deuteronomy 23, verses 2 through 6, there is a specific prohibition that excludes the Moabites from ever being included in the Israelite community. This was seen as extremely important because not only was this early in Israel's story, but the Moabite women in tempting the Israelite men, this was not just about sexual dalliances. This was a temptation to worship their gods. Idolatry and adultery in Israel's thought are always going to be synonymous because the covenant between Israel and God is like a marriage covenant. And so you will find adultery and idolatry that are metaphorically identical. So, given that this story has these undertones that are more than significant, we need to take a look also at when this was written, and so we can understand why it was written, for whom it was written. So what I'm going to have you do is look at your book, pages 58 to 59, okay? What we've got here, this way. We talked a lot about the Yahwist, the Elohist, the Deuteronomist, and the priest, those traditions. If we look at the age of the monarchy here, during that time of stability, while David and then Solomon were king, these stories became written down. The Yahwist stories committed to writing, as is the Elohist. It is during the time of the divided kingdom. The north has fallen to Assyria, but Judah exists, and this is when the Deuteronomist's story is being written. During the exile is when the priestly story gets put into writing, and the priest begins at this point, continues down here, to gather this all up. It is after the exile, when they've returned, that this all gets woven together. We've talked a lot about that. So if this is when these were all put together, where does the book of Ruth fit? Think about what you read. Once in the time of the judges is the opening line. So the story is set in the period of the judges, very early. But the language tells us of that once upon a time characteristic to the story. Back when. It's written later. We also see an interesting, I want you to learn to take a look at these details. An interesting one at the end of the story, in chapter 4, verse 7, when Boaz is sitting at the gate with the kinsmen and they are negotiating. And verse 7 says, "Now it used to be the custom in Israel that to make binding a contract of redemption or exchange, one party would take off his sandal." So again, it was back then what they did was, not only was it back then, but it was far enough back that people have lost that in their common memory. And so the author is reminding them that that's how it used to be back then. So we know it was a little bit later. We can also tell it kind of from the story itself. It is not a combination of several sources. It has one author. It's seamless. It's more sophisticated. It's more like a little novella in the way that it is. So why is it here in the Bible at all? Is it about this lovely story of the two women who combine forces to overcome adversity by being faithful and loving and loyal? Yes. But it's also there to challenge Israel. Because if in fact a Moabite woman is cast as the heroine of the story, then what we have here is something more like one of Jesus' parables, when he tells the story of the Samaritan as being the good guy, is the hero. That's what this is the equivalent of in its own time. It twists things and shocks and surprises and challenges Israel. This is further compounded by the fact that the law of levirate is applied here to this Moabite woman. The law of levirate, let me explain a little bit about that to you. It is the law that provides for the woman whose husband has died and left her childless. She has the right, and his family has the obligation to provide her with an heir. So, the deceased husband's brother, and then there's a whole determination, this is where that next of kin comes in, has the obligation to take her under his protection and provide her with a son. And that's what's happening here between Boaz and this next kinsman. There's one person closer than he in that line. But he frames the interpretation of the law in such a way that he points out, if you do this, the child, of course, inherits, becomes Naomi's son-in-law's heir. And he loses property, actually, then. Which, of course, is to Boaz's advantage, because he wants to marry Ruth. But the kinsman sees it, and this gives him a face-baiting way to bow out. Thanks, but no thanks. And it leaves the door open for Boaz. And it invites Ruth into the community and under the protection of the law. Interesting that this law existed to protect families, protect women, protect Israel, protect property, but it wasn't meant to protect Moabites. And here, because Boaz chooses to interpret it, he lays it out that way, that's indeed what happens. And so there's a challenge also here to Israel to use the law in a way that is not solely linked to the letter of the law, but to the higher purpose of the law, to enact justice. Not use the law in a way that oppresses the widow or the foreigner, the ones on the margins, but in a way that brings about justice. So we have challenges on many levels here. We have the challenge of the Moabite heroine, an example of Hesed. We have the challenge of what is Israel going to do with the stranger in our midst. We have the challenge to a higher level of interpreting the law, a way that has to do with justice, not just legality. Much more to the story, perhaps, than we realized at first. Well, alas, with this story, we are leaving the Hebrew Scriptures. I hope you've enjoyed them. We're moving on into more familiar territory with the woman Elizabeth. Marvelous bridge between the two testaments of the Old and the New. I know you're going to enjoy it. I look forward to sharing more with you. God bless. Thank you.